All right, so I guess it took us, we've been down, let me start over. Figure out what talking about. So I don't remember the exact route we went down, but we started a path a little while ago. What did we watch before? Before M Squad. What led us to M Squad with Lee Marvin?
What was it that we watched? God, I can't remember.
Quark. Oh, that must be why.
Yeah. Oh, you're going way back.
We got recommended the show Quark, and I found out Quark was made by the guy who did Get Smart. So we watched to Get
True.
Smart, and then Get Smart made me think of Police Squad. Yeah, and then Police Squad led to M Squad led to the Mod Squad. So yeah, we've been on a sort of basic path of cop type shows or spy type shows or espionage or whatever, be they serious or comedic. So we're finally at the Avengers, because I guess we've just been circling this one for a bit, waiting to get here. So I just remember the Avengers being a show that was on a lot when I was a kid. You must have been watching it in reruns when I was a kid. I assume it was like A&E. Do you remember in the 80s? And
For sure. It was, British TV it would be the late 60s when the Cold War was really at its height. And of course, you had all those James Bond films with Sean Connery from the 1960s, extremely popular, and so much spy stuff. Because that's just what it was in the 60s, the third world and the Russians versus the Americans and all this espionage stuff going on. So the Avengers is out of there, but it's British MI5 and all that business. And of course, you get John Steed and his cohort Emma Peel, who of course is the sexy looking girl that has to be in those things. They can never just have male spy. They got to have some woman connected in with them too, who's a real gorgeous little babe. Um, but it's that standard British stuff, where they don't just put everything in your face and they make you second guess things, and you really have to watch stuff to kind of figure out what's going on. And sometimes it's only at the very end that it all kind of falls into place. Very, underplayed and downplayed, and good show, good show.
yeah, it's one of those shows I remember. I more, I guess, remember it just being on, or I remember you watching it more than I remember it myself. I definitely remember John Steed and Emma Peel. But now that I looked into it a bit, yeah, there's a lot more to this show than I realized, so it's kind of cool. So I guess I can just give you the quick rundown of stuff I learned about the Avengers. Because the other thing that's neat about this show is it came out at just the right time that a lot of the stuff we've talked about on this podcast about different eras of especially British TV, this straddled all of them. It's like every type of British show that there was, tech wise, it seems like this show kind of touched on. So, The Avengers, it's a British espionage television series created in 1961 that ran until 1969 for 161 episodes. But those early ones, as I get into it, you'll see why I don't even know if they ever aired over here. It was like a whole different thing. So it initially focused on David Keel, played by Ian Hendry with a D. Do you know Ian Hendry?
I don't think, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, because he left the show to go on to movies, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know who he is, so maybe we'd know his face if we saw him.
Yeah, maybe.
But it doesn't really matter because the episodes he was on don't exist mostly anymore. But okay, I'll get to that. So he was David Keel, aided by John Steed, played by Patrick McNee. Hendry left after the first series, and Steed then became the main character, partnered with a succession of assistants.
Babes.
Yeah, so I guess in season one it was two dudes, and yeah, they were like, no, thank you, let's bring in someone. His most famous assistants were intelligent, stylish, and assertive women. Of course, Emma Peel as Diana Rigg, but also Kathy Gale, played by Honor Blackman, aka Pussy Galore.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pussy Galore from James Bond.
Yeah.
I vaguely remember her being in those.
There's a line in the movie Trainspotting. It's not nice, but he's like, Pussy fucking galore, what a fucking misnomer. I would not touch her with yours. It's like, come on, she's pretty hot. But apparently they didn't think so. So by 1969, The Avengers was shown in more than 90 countries. So yeah, like a ridiculous success. And then ITV produced a sequel series called The New Avengers in 1976 and 1977, with Patrick Macnee returning as John Steed, but with two new partners. Did you ever see that show?
I think I did see some of the new Avengers. I don't think it was as good though, if I what I remember of it.
It definitely did not survive into reruns because I did not know there was another one. In 2004 and 2007, The Avengers was ranked number 17 and number 20 on TV Guide's top cult shows ever. So yeah, so here's the by season, just the different weird stuff that happened with this show. So in season one, Ian Hendry was considered the star. He had top billing over McNee, and the series was shot on 405 line videotape. And there was little provision for editing, and virtually no location footage was shot. And as was standard practice at the time, videotapes of early episodes of The Avengers were quote unquote reused, aka erased. So only 3 episodes from season one still exist. And we've mentioned that many times as these old shows, it's such a shame that they taped over them. But the way they described that here, it does make more sense. If it's taped on videotape, no provision for editing, and no location footage. So basically, they're just shooting a play. They can't edit it, they have to do it all on a stage. So it kind of makes more sense when you think of it that way for them to tape over it, because they were only taping it in the first place in order to broadcast the play they were putting on. It does kind of make sense that that doesn't feel like something you need to hold on to. It was just a middle step to get the play onto TV, and then you tape over it. I mean, it's still a shame, but that did help me understand a little of like, oh yeah, like to them this wasn't a TV show. It was just a play on TV.
Like something live action. And also, they would have no idea about the longevity of this thing, that it would be so popular. They probably just said, oh, yeah, okay, we think it's pretty darn good, but let's get this show out. But it probably has limits as to who's going to watch it. So when they're short of money, short of time, yeah, let's just go over that one and use parts of it if we have to, because we just got to get this show out. Like, you wouldn't be thinking 50 years down the line, what are people going to say about this show? Nobody thinks that. They just think, hey, get it out today. We got to get this job done. We got to get our pay.
Yeah, and they definitely, obviously, couldn't conceive at all of the magical infinite space of the internet. Now that we can put every TV show ever made on the internet 1,000 times over, and it's just invisible. It's just floating in the air. I mean, like, yeah, I'm just going to have you click a link on the computer and we can magically watch it. Like, obviously, they didn't know that was coming. So by season 2, Hendry had quit to pursue a film career. There was also a strike that happened in season 1, so he was extra willing to get out of TV and try to get into movies. So McNee was promoted to the star. That's when Honor Blackman was introduced as Dr. Kathy Gale, a self-assured, quick-witted anthropologist who was unlike other female characters of the time. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about her character, but it does seem like the sort of mold Emma Peel was in first was done with this other character. But a kind of interesting thing, because I've heard this happen in other examples too, one of the reasons why she was this like brassy, strong character who was the equal of John Steed was because the writers just took Ian Hendry's dialogue and they're like, we're not going to rewrite all this. So they just gave her the dialogue that was meant for a man. So she got to be a main character in this backward sexist way, And it's like, oh, I guess whatever gets you there.
But again, that's very fitting for the time, because you had the women's lib movement was just really starting to gain momentum in the early 1960s, which later, really developed in the late 1960s, but was starting to get a hold, and women were starting to get into the workforce, and they had just gone through World War II about 10 years earlier, and had been 10, 15 years earlier, had been working in factories and all this stuff. And then when the men came back, they weren't really content to go back into the kitchen and do all that barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen routine. So it's fitting that there is a woman character being introduced in the early 1960s who's very smart, mannish, possibly, lives in a man's world and doesn't take a lot of guff off of anybody. That it's kind of a forerunner to what was going to happen in the world later, with the women kind of taking hold of things.
Yeah, it definitely was appropriate to the time, like the right character at the right time. It's just kind of weird and sort of disappointing to learn that it was like almost an accident. You know, there was this TV strike and then their star left and they were just too lazy to rewrite the dialogue, and then by accident, it wasn't anybody's like distinct choice. It just luckily turned out that way. And there's an even worse story like that once we get to Diana Rigg, but I'll get there pretty soon. Yeah, so then Blackman left because she was cast opposite Sean Connery in Goldfinger, requiring her to leave the series. So that was season 2 and 3. Then season 4 was the big jump. So probably, well, I guess for sure the stuff that we had rerun here, because it was always had Diana Rigg pretty much in it, was at this point. Because this is where instead of filming it like a play or filming it in one take and all that stuff, for the 4th season, the show was sold to the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, in 1965. The Avengers became one of the first British series to be aired on primetime U.S. television. And the U.S. deal meant money, so it meant the producers could afford to start shooting the series on 35mm film, which they had to do anyway because those British videotapes were not compatible with our NTSC videotapes. We just had 2 different formats, so they couldn't easily show the old episodes anyway. So it was like a win-win. They got to film on film. They got to film it like a real TV show, quote unquote, and yeah, just made it to America. So the new female partner was Mrs. Emma Peel, Diana Rigg, who debuted in October 1965. Okay, so this is, again, one of these things that this is much worse than the Honor Blackman example. So yeah, the name Emma Peel, where it came from, is they wanted a character with man appeal, and when they were developing this character, they called her Samantha Peel, just as a weird joke about man appeal, which they shortened to Mantha Peel. And in their script, as a shorthand, they just called this Mantha Peel, which is Mantha. What the hell kind of name is Mantha? They shortened it to M Appeal for man appeal. And then M Appeal, obviously, is Emma Peel. So her name is basically hot girl, is like basically what Emma Peel comes from. So again, it's like so weird that you've got this character who became such an icon and was so famous, but essentially backstage they were calling her like, I don't know, Hot Boots McTithaver or whatever. Like it's just like this it's just such a silly name. But I guess it's fine because nobody at home knew this origin story. They didn't know. They just think she's this cool, self-assured character. But again, it's just disappointing when you hear the behind the scenes and it's like, man,
Oh, I know.
yeah, like the men of 1965 were not at all progressive yet. Like again, just like an accident almost.
The women were progressive, the men weren't.
Yeah, which speaking of, to wrap up with the different stuff, for the 5th season, the show moved to color. So again, it went all the way from the tape system to film to then to color. But Diana Rigg left the series because of poor pay. She was actually getting paid less than some of the crew. And when she found out, she insisted they pay her like a star of the show, which she was. So they did do that. But just in general, the producers, she just felt never treated her very well. So she moved on to also go on to film. And then the show really didn't last too long without her. They did try to bring in another woman, but she was like the girlfriend of a producer. It didn't work. Although Diana Rigg and Patrick Macnee remained lifelong friends. So that's nice. Those two got along. It was just the people behind the scenes that kind of sucked. But yeah, I was just going to say too, and hold on, what episode do we have? I looked up just a list of, good episodes of The Avengers, and I jumped us to season 4 when Emma Peel arrived. So we are in black and white, but we are at the point where it was shot on film. This is season 4, episode 9. It's called The Hour That Never Was. So if anybody wants to watch along at home, that's what we're watching. But real quick before we throw that on, I'll just mention real quick that the other famous example I always heard of this similar type of situation, especially with how Honor Blackman just had Ian Hendry's dialogue, is the other example like that is Ellen Ripley from Alien, who, I think that was 1979, but again, like a very famous female character. But it turns out that in the script, they were all soldiers. So she was just labeled as Ripley. And the reason she's such a cool badass who beats the alien in the end is because, again, she wasn't supposed to be a woman. Ripley was just one of the soldiers. And then they cast a woman and accidentally moved society forward a little bit. But it's a very similar story of like, man, these behind the scenes stories are not always very fun to learn.
Well,
So yeah, with my very limited memory of that show, to me that felt like a very weird episode. Did you feel that way, or did that more or less is that more or less how you remembered the Avengers?
I remember them as being very convoluted, so that you couldn't really figure out what was happening. And this did that. I mean, I didn't have a friggin' clue what was going on until they all brought it together in the last, let's say, 5 minutes. That's what I remember about these shows.
Yeah, and I'll give it credit for that. I'm surprised that it had such a coherent explanation. Basically, anyone who hasn't seen this episode, we're going to kind of spoil it now, but it's like a mind control plot, like a Manchurian Candidate thing. This guy, he's trying to brainwash a bunch of military people because their units being broken up and sent around the world. So he'll have like sleeper agents that he can sell to the highest bidder, spread all over the world. But leading up to that explanation is like just like an empty base, and it seems like time is frozen, and yeah, it's like really made no sense. So I was kind of impressed that in the end it actually made sense. you know.
That's my
Go ahead.
memory of these shows, of always being very like, yeah, like what the hell's happening here? And it was the kind of show that you couldn't just go to the fridge and muck around and come back and being able just to tie back into it. You couldn't, because you couldn't figure out what was going on. Very, very British in its genre. Very, very British.
Yeah, and I do wonder sometimes if, when I look up these lists of top episodes, sometimes that can lead you to weird stuff because the episodes that really stick in people's memories sometimes are the more unusual ones. So I feel like that could be the case here because, like, what was kind of interesting about that episode is that for, like, the first at least half of the episode, it really was just the two main characters in an empty airfield. And it did kind of show, like, what a good rapport they had with each other, that they made that interesting. But it was certainly weird, Like, I bet that is one of those episodes that you would remember years later. You're like, hey, remember that one? That was a weird one, But I don't know. I would question if this is really one of the best ones. I feel like it's probably not, but it wasn't bad. It was definitely interesting.
I could see a lot of people watching that, walking away from that show and saying, nothing's happening. I'm not going to watch that. But yeah, you got to hang in there. And it all comes together at the end.
Although I was surprised, too, reading about it, that they brought up that it kind of became more and more sci-fi as it went. Because, again, in my limited memory, I thought it was more of a straightforward, I knew he was like a kind of cool gentleman, sort of like James Bond, but more lighthearted. I didn't realize it had this like science fiction-y type stuff, and this episode did feel like The Outer Limits a bit, or Twilight Zone. But even that, like, light, not as weird as that, but sort of like that.
But yet, when it all comes together at the end, it's very much into that spy business where they're always trying new experimental drugs, and there's always that kind of weird stuff going on in espionage that you wouldn't normally, well, in the normal world, you'd have no contact with at all.
Yeah, and it really is, yeah, it is impressive in that way that it went from starting like the Twilight Zone and ending like a spy thing. But yeah, I remember I read a thing once about they tried to train cats to do surveillance. I think it was during the Cold War, because a cat's so innocuous, no one suspects a cat. So they figured out how to hook up cameras and stuff to this cat, and they spent all kinds of money trying to train this cat, and the cat just ran off and like got hit by a truck or something like right away, because you can't train a cat. But that's a good example of, yeah, they're always trying to do some weird thing just to get one up on the enemy. One thing that it reminded me of, speaking of British TV, just I guess the way, he's the older, more experienced fellow, and he has the young, more amateur companion. And I guess with the sci-fi stuff, it gave me a real Doctor Who vibe, like this could almost be Doctor Who and Doctor Who's companion coming up against a weird situation. It felt kind of like that.
Yeah, I thought of that myself. Actually, Doctor Who crossed my mind at certain points where I was watching this.
When you were watching these, do you remember? I don't remember like if the ones I saw were more black and white or color. Do you remember if you saw the color ones more or the black and white ones more?
I would have seen the black and white ones, but then we didn't have a color TV as soon as color TVs came out either. We were still watching some black and white after color had hit the scenes. But I don't remember watching them. Like after I moved to Campbello Island, I remember Star Trek being a real big deal, and it was in color on our TV. I don't remember really seeing much of the Avengers once I was in high
That
school and moved to Campbello.
that is a good point. I hadn't thought of that about it doesn't matter, I guess, if the show's in color or not. If your TV is not in color, that didn't even cross my mind.